Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a second time by Dr. Joseph LeDoux. He is the Harry and Lucy Moses Professor of Science at New York University. Last time we talked about his book, The Deep History of Ourselves. I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And today we're talking about his latest book, The Four Realms of Existence, a new theory of being human. So, Dr. LeDoux, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you for having me again, Ricardo.
So, just to introduce the topic here, in the book, you go through four realms of what you call existence: bodily, neural, cognitive, and conscious. We're going to talk about each of them. But at the very beginning of the book, one of the first things you touch on is the idea of mind-body dualism. So, where do you think it stems from, and why is it important to refer to it in the context of your book? Exactly.
Well, I refer to it as a way to dispose of it, not to celebrate it.
Sure.
Traditionally, mind-body dualism goes back to Descartes. Long before him, but he had a particular kind of mind-body dualism called interactionism, where the soul or the mind could interact with the body through the famous pineal gland. But that was the idea. And so philosophers ever since have been struggling with, mind and body, and are they separate? Are they different kinds of substances and so forth? And to me, in scientific times where we live now, where we've, discovered DNA and we know all about, atoms and molecules.
Yeah.
If you start talking about looking for a spirit in the brain, if you're looking for something that is not physical in the brain, you're never going to find that. And that's the whole problem for me with my colleague David Chalmers and Tom Nagel, both of whom are at NYU. I don't believe that the qualia are ineffable, non-physical entities. That's fine for a philosophical theory, but it's a non-starter for a scientific theory. If it's not physical, you can't study it, so it's not science. And one thing that happens is that, science and philosophy were once way back, like in the 19th century, there was a lot of interaction, but then they fell apart. And right now, where we are is at a situation where philosophy has come in and is providing all of the conceptual major points from which scientists pursue things like consciousness. And I think that's useful to have a philosophical theory as a grounding point, but it should really be a starting point. And you can't expect the science that results from that starting point to always adhere to the philosophical theory, because science is going to discover things. And the dualists cling to the idea that we're never going to find out how qualia works because it's non-physical. So if that's true, it's a non-starter scientifically. So either it's physical or it's not scientific.
So one very interesting thing that you also talk about in your book is how you collaborated in studies with split brain patients. So, in what ways does that connect to the ideas you explore in your book, and why did you get interested in those kinds of studies?
Well, there are two questions there. The first one, I had 2 degrees in business administration and marketing. I had a master's in marketing and an undergraduate in business administration. And I took a course with a guy who was studying learning and emotion. That was his class. And I thought that would be relevant to marketing. But instead, what he was doing was studying rat brains and memory. He had worked with the esteemed Carl Lashley and was trying to do what Lashley failed to do, which is to find memory in the brain. And he, I fell in love with what he was doing. It was just so fantastic. I was just a small kid from a small town in Louisiana, and, I didn't know you could study the brain. And so that became fantastic. And I worked with him for a few months, and then I said, this is what I want to do. And he gave me wrote me a letter, and I got accepted into Stony Brook out on Long Island to do my PhD. And that's where I met Mike Gazzaniga. And Mike and I kind of hit it off right away. He had done his PhD studying split brain patients and in California at Caltech. And he was about 10 years older than me, still kind of a young guy. And we came across this new set of patients up in New England that had been just operated on. And so we started doing the same old stuff that you normally do with split brain patients, like, you show a stimulus to the left visual field, it goes to the right hemisphere. You say to the patient, what did you see? The left hemisphere is the talking hemisphere. It says, I didn't see anything, but the left hand can reach into a bag and pull an apple out if we had shown it a picture of an apple. So we were doing the same old stuff again, over and over again. It wasn't going anywhere. There was nothing new, really, until we came across one patient in whom we, for some reason, I forget why, but we put words in the right hemisphere just to see if it could read anything. One of the big issues in split brain patients has always been, is there someone home in the left hemisphere? Or is all of the conscious stuff coming out of is there someone home in the right hemisphere? Because the left hemisphere is the conscious one you talk to and so forth. And it's been difficult. It was difficult to know because you could only use nonverbal responses to test that. Could it point to a picture and stuff? Yeah. So that was that's where things stood. But we happened to put some words in the right hemisphere and gave the boy a bunch of Scrabble letters to see if he could spell what he saw, what letters he saw in the right hemisphere. Or we could have put a picture like apple, and then he would spell with his left hand APPLE. So he could read the pictures, or he could see an apple and turn it into words with his left hand, or he could put the words in the right hemisphere, and he could spell the name of the thing or point to the picture of the thing from his right hemisphere. So he could read in his right hemisphere, but he couldn't talk from it. So we said, okay, that's interesting if he can read common words there, but does he have a social sense? We put the letters in the left visual field. What is your name? And the left hand came out and it spells his name, Paul. So, okay, he knows who he is over there. He's not just a smart chimpanzee. There's a human being over there that knows his name. It knew his girlfriend's name. When you say, who's your girlfriend? He spells Liz, and on and on. And so we asked the right hemisphere what it wanted to be when it grew up. What would the occupation be? The right hemisphere said race car driver. And the left hemisphere in conversation wants to be an architect. So we've got one hemisphere with one goal in life, another hemisphere with another goal in life, and they were different. So clearly there was a kind of conscious self on both sides of the brain. And that was the first time that had ever been fully demonstrated. People assumed there was someone awake and alive in the right hemisphere, but you could never have a conversation with that person. So that was a real breakthrough. And then, but the key experiments we did in terms of both my career going forward and Mike's was we put two pictures, one on the left side of the screen, one on the right side of the screen. Mm-hmm. The right side of the screen goes to the left hemisphere.
Yes.
There we put a chicken claw, just the claw of the chicken picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In the left hemisphere, the left visual field, we put a snow scene. Okay. So the left hemisphere saw a chicken claw. The right hemisphere saw a snow scene. So the right hand, because it saw a snow scene, pointed to a shovel. Mm-hmm. And the left hand, because it saw a chicken claw, pointed to a chicken. Okay. So we knew why he did that. But so when we asked the left hemisphere, why did you pick those? He said, well, I saw a chicken claw, so I pointed to a chicken, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed. The left hemisphere knew nothing about the snow scene. It made up a story observing the two hands and what they were pointing to. One was controlled by the left hemisphere. So, at first we kind of thought, well, this is just normal kind of neurological confabulation to make up for a deficit that you have, because often neurological patients do confabulate. But then, the more we thought about it, this was just something that we all do all the time, that a lot of our behavior is produced non-consciously. Like, I just rock back in the chair, or I wave my hand, or you're driving down the road and you're not paying attention, but you're driving fine. All kinds of things we do are done non-consciously. We're talking non-consciously. You and I are not planning each sentence we say, it just comes out. And so if we have all these non-conscious systems in our brain producing behaviors, it helps if we can kind of put it all together and make our non-conscious behavior make sense with our sense of who we are in a more cognitive sense of who we are. And so the idea we had was that it's, if you have any sense of free will, I think we have some free will, then it's disturbing. It causes cognitive dissonance if you think that you are not in charge of your behavior, right? If you're doing things that aren't in your control, it can be a source of cognitive dissonance. So our idea was that the human brain evolved a kind of mechanism to resolve this dissonance in the fact that consciousness, our conscious minds, don't have conscious access to a lot of the behavior we do. But to make everything seem right most of the time and not have to be kind of always questioning, did I do that? Did I not do that? We have this sense of being able to cognitively interpret our behavior and our thoughts and other things and make sense of them in light of who we think we are. In other words, we generate narrations to explain who we are. And so ever since that evening in Bennington, Vermont, which is where the patient lived, and we were talking about this at the bar, I've been kind of obsessed with that idea. And so has Mike, and we both have written books about all this. And I went on to, I was interested in emotion, and we decided emotions might be one of the systems in the brain that would require or demand these dissonance-reducing explanations. Because if you have all these unconscious emotion systems that cause you to freeze or run or to do things you don't want to do, or you didn't or don't necessarily plan doing, to resolve that dissonance, we tell a story. And that story is an emotional story about who we are and why we did what we do. So, I didn't have patience anymore to study. So I had to find something else to do. And I turned to studies of rats because I assumed we could study emotional behaviors in rats, and the same systems would be involved in these unconscious emotional behaviors in humans. Even though I couldn't study emotional consciousness in humans, I could study the behaviors that might be generating these dissonance-inducing narrations in us. So that was the basic idea. And I went on for, my first grant on emotion in rats was rejected because the study section said neuroscientists don't study emotions. It was still the behaviorist era in a sense. And then the next comment was, and besides, you're doing Pavlovian conditioning, and you didn't use a non-associative control group. So I was really mad, to get those comments. But I saw the writing on the wall that behaviorism still is a very strong force in psychology, especially in the study of animal behavior, and it still is today. By the way, it has not gone away. So if I was going to survive by studying Pavlovian conditioning, which is what I was doing, I had to add that control group. But I also had to disguise myself as a learning and memory researcher in order to get my grants and to stay funded, because emotion was not something that was going to fly at that time. Mm-hmm. This was the mid-1980s. So I started going to learning and memory meetings and became, a well-known researcher studying fear conditioning and the amygdala and all of that. I didn't go looking for the amygdala. The brain took me to the amygdala. had spent 10 years in a neurobiology lab where there were every technique you could need to study the brain. And so when I was studying rats, I wanted to know, how does a tone go into the rat's ear and then come out of the rat's body in the form of a freezing behavior or a change in blood pressure and heart rate that's metabolically supporting that freezing behavior? So it was a question of how you get from the input to the output. Now, in the aplesia, Eric Kandel and others made very quick work of that because they had a simple stimulus. They were using like Pavlovian conditioning too, and a very rigid response, the Gill withdrawal reflex of the aplesia. And, you know, I was using Pavlovian conditioning. I had a simple stimulus, a tone paired with a shock, and a simple behavior, freezing behavior. It was an innate behavior. So I said, I can connect the dots in the brain too. So what I didn't start at the ear, because you lesion the ear, then you're not going to hear anything. Start at the auditory cortex. But because the auditory cortex in the rat had never been formally mapped, we had to map it. Because I had all those new anatomical techniques I'd learned as a postdoc, we were able to quickly map the auditory cortex with tracing studies. That showed us where we had to remove the auditory cortex to see if that was involved in the conditioning. We took it out on both sides of the brain, and the rats could still be conditioned. So how does the stimulus go from the auditory thalamus to some part of the brain that controls the behavior if it's not going through the auditory cortex? Well, we looked at our tracing studies, anatomical studies, and there were connections from the medial geniculate nucleus, not just to the cortex, but also to the hypothalamus, the caudate putamen, the some intralaminar thalamic nuclei, and the amygdala. So we lesioned each one of those, and only the amygdala had an effect. So now we know the stimulus has to go to the amygdala to do the trick, get the behavior out. Okay. Yeah. So we said, well, it's not the whole amygdala because the tracer was only in one part, the lateral amygdala, coming from the thalamus. Yeah. So the auditory thalamic input to the amygdala was to the lateral nucleus. So okay, that made sense. So a lot of sensory information is coming in there. And so we started focusing on that. We showed that you could induce, if you recorded from cells there, well, first we lesioned the lateral amygdala in that block conditioning. If we put electrodes in there, we could record the activity of the cells during conditioning. If we electrically stimulated the inputs from the thalamus to the lateral amygdala, we could induce LTP in the lateral amygdala, and so on. So we had a lot of evidence that the lateral amygdala was kind of the learning center for fear conditioning. And so the question then is, how does it go from the lateral amygdala down to the body? Well, another researcher, Bruce Kapp, had implicated the central nucleus of the amygdala in the control of certain cardiovascular responses following Pavlovian conditioning. So our tracing studies found connections from the lateral to the central amygdala, and that kind of closed the circle right there. But for the freezing behavior, we had to find a different output because the cardiovascular responses were going down to the brainstem to control the parasympathetic nervous system. But what we found was that for the freezing behavior, it had to go from the central amygdala to the periaqueductal gray, and from there down to the motor systems that control it. So within a very small number of years, we were able to go from the ear to the muscles, basically, that control the responses. And the trick was following the invertebrate model where you have a simple stimulus and a very well established, hardwired response that is basically a reflex that you just connect the inputs to. And so that was really the beginning of my career. Right around that time, I was moving to NYU. And the week before I arrived, there was an article written up in the New York Times, Science Times, called "Brain's Design Emerges as Key to Emotion." And that article was written by Dan Goleman, who went on to make very popular the idea of emotional intelligence. he was writing for the New York Times at the time, and he'd done a lot of research on my work. And what he was particularly fascinated with was the subcortical input to the amygdala that could control behavior without it going through the cortex. I call that the low road, whereas the cortical route to the amygdala is the high road. But we didn't need the high road. All you needed was the low road. And so the idea was that you could have the driving of emotional behavior by the thalamic to amygdala pathway, which would be producing the behavior unconsciously, getting back to my whole idea of these unconscious behaviors. So you could control the behavior unconsciously. The Freudians went wild. Finally, there was some evidence for unconscious control of emotional behavior. Goleman's first book on emotional intelligence, I think the first several chapters were all about my work. So it was good for me and it was good for him. So we both kind of got something out of that. It really gave me kind of a public presence. A year or two after that, I wrote The Emotional Brain because I had some, cachet with the public at that point because my name was getting out. So in The Emotional Brain, I described all the Pavlovian conditioning work, but also wrote about how consciousness of emotions comes about, which is through the high road, going to the prefrontal cortex, allowing you to cognitively interpret the situation that you're in. So from the beginning, I talked about emotional behaviors as being unconscious, but the emotional experience being conscious through separate pathways. I tried calling the unconscious pathway implicit fear and high road explicit fear, but that didn't take off in emotion the way it did in memory research, because still a lot of the people doing the behavioral work were behaviorists, and they didn't believe in consciousness, so they didn't need to talk about unconscious because you don't have any consciousness, there's no unconscious to contrast it with. So they just ignored the implicit, explicit, and just talked about fear as behavior. And so for decades, this was like an imperceptible itch that I needed to scratch. I would be introduced at lectures as someone who discovered how fear comes out of the amygdala. And I would say, it's not quite right, because I'm talking about the fear behavior. I'm not studying the fear emotion experience in the rat. That has to be done in humans. But time after time, I would be introduced the same way because it's very useful sometimes for your science to be distributed to the public, but sometimes that the public's perception of the science comes back into the science and becomes what the scientists think, right?
Yeah.
And so there was my colleagues, the behaviorist colleagues, who didn't like the fact that I was talking about emotion and consciousness and so forth, would think of fear in the behavior sense as a stimulus-response relationship. So fear was not a mental state in the amygdala or anywhere else. It was the functional relationship between an outside stimulus and a response to that stimulus. Now, in the middle of the 20th century, some behaviorists became physiologists. So the intervening variable was introduced by Tolman in the 1920s. So for these physiologists in the middle of the 20th century, what the amygdala was doing for fear was providing a physiological state of fear that connects stimulus and response, not a subjective, no conscious fear, just something they called the physiology of fear, just as the behaviorists talked about the circuit as fear. So you have that going on, and pretty soon, again, everybody is still talking about fear. So the question you wonder is, why did the behaviorists get rid of conscious fear, but still call the behavior fear? Because for most people, fear would be the subjective experience. And it's because they didn't believe that there was anything in the head, right? So they could just call it fear. And since there was no conscious or unconscious for them, it was just fear. So by 2012, I was really annoyed with all of this, I thought, bad language. And so I started writing articles like Rethinking the Emotional Brain, where I said what the amygdala does is detects and responds to threats. That's an ancient evolutionary process that goes all the way back to the beginning of animal life. And in the 2019 book, The Deep History of Our Cells, I said it goes all the way back to the first bacterial cell. You have to be able to detect and respond to danger. You have to have something on your membrane that prevents you from swimming into toxic water, and something on your membrane that allows you to swim towards food. So their membrane was able to guide them towards survival behaviors like this. And I'm not saying that we inherited, for example, freezing behavior from bacteria, but instead, what I said in the book was that the earliest cells developed what was necessary for the cell to stay alive. Those became the key components of a cell, of cellular life. So what was passed on was the survival needs of the cell, not how you satisfy those survival needs, right? So bacteria survive by approaching food in one way and avoiding danger in another way, but they do it. They have no, their bodies are very primitive. When you get into animals that have different kinds of bodies, for example, a sponge, the body of the sponge is very different from the body of a jellyfish, which followed sponges. But so they acquire food and protection in different ways. They have to have the same survival requirements, but they implement it in different ways. Take mammals. Some mammals run away from danger, some fly away from danger, some swim away from danger. You have all kinds of ways of responding to danger. That's not what's been inherited. What's been inherited is the imperative or the need to detect danger, to incorporate nutrients and balance fluids, to detect danger and move away from it, and so forth. So, and to reproduce, of course. So, what I was proposing in this book, this article, Rethinking the Emotional Brain, was to stop calling things that weren't mental states. It's simple. So I started with a quote in that article from Tinbergen, who was very well respected, right? He said that our presumptions about what hunger and fear and all of these emotions are in other animals are mere guesses. We have no idea what's going on. We should talk about them in different ways. He was, basically saying, let's not anthropomorphize on the basis of behavior, because we don't know what's going on in the head. So I wrote that, and I wrote all kinds of other articles, like one was called Semantics, Surplus Meaning, and the Science of Fear. It's about how throughout history, there have been scientists who have questioned the way the scientific language is used. And I think that's very important, that we not mistreat our language or misuse our language. For example, each field is different. So in biology, there's a gene called hedgehog. So when a biologist talks about hedgehog, no one thinks they're talking about a hedgehog, right? It's just a nickname. In psychology and neuroscience, we have a different relationship to these words. When we use a mental state word like fear to talk about a brain circuit that controls an innate behavior, that's not fear. That's a defensive response. If we call it fear, everybody thinks fear is living in the amygdala. And that's how we got to all these problems. And that's why the entire medical industry to treat psychiatric disorders doesn't really work, because you develop animal models and you test drugs that make them freeze less. And you think because the rat froze less, a human will feel less fearful and less anxious. But instead, what you find is the patient is less avoidant. They go to the party a little easier, and they're less aroused, so they can stay in the party a little easier. But they're still anxious and fearful. But if the drugs were sold not as anti-anxiety pills, but as coping pills, anxiety coping pills, you'd be able to take the drug and understand that what you can do is use it to help you cope with the physical symptoms. And then psychologically, you'd be in a better position to reevaluate your situation. So I talk about it sometimes in terms of, first you have to tame the amygdala. This is metaphorically, not literally.
Sure.
Change the amygdala, because spider phobics don't want to see see spiders when they're doing like cognitive behavioral therapy. So one way you might do that is subliminal presentation of spiders to spider phobics. They would never consciously know they're there, but it might extinguish the amygdala. I don't know. I've promoted that for a while, but I don't know anyone who's done it. So tame the amygdala. You might do that with cognitive behavioral therapy or distraction. If you can keep the conscious mind distracted while still being extinguished, that might work. Second, you want to tame the hippocampus. Rewrite some of those memories about who you think you are and what your labels are and so forth, and just re-narrate your score. If because a lot of what we do that gets us in trouble psychologically is our narrations about the situation and who we are. And if we can narrate in, maybe we can narrate out. And then third, once you've done those two things, the brain is ready for psychotherapy, regular old talk therapy. But if the therapist has to deal with an anxious body and bad memories and at the same time try to do the kind of mano or womano exchange, it's too much to be done at one time. Do them separately. Get rid of the most basic first, or tame those first. Tame the cognitive memories second, and then you can have a better time talking. That would be my opinion. We haven't gotten very far on this all day, right? I'm talking too much.
No, but then tell us then, related to this latest book, how did you get this idea of 4 realms of existence? The bodily, the neural, the cognitive, and the conscious, and how do they relate to one another? Actually?
Yeah. It's like the question is, how do I start writing that book? And this is true of every book. It's just, you get one idea. Like in Deep History, it was like, I made the connection between, okay, I had been studying molecules involved in Pavlovian conditioning that I was borrowing those molecules from Eric Kandel, who studied aplesia, cyclic AMP and PKA, all kinds of molecular tools. And so, we would do that, and we could show that we could block LTP with those, and we could block Pavlovian conditioning with those. And so we were using the same molecules that were used by animals that had a 630 million year difference between the ones we were using and the ones Kandel were using, because the common ancestor of the so-called protostome invertebrates and the vertebrates was 630 million years ago, a flatworm, bilateral flatworm with a little brain. So that became the invertebrates and the vertebrates. So it dawned on me one day that, that how do we have the same molecules in these groups that are so diverged? Well, one possibility is they separately evolved them, but the other possibility is that they inherited those from the common ancestor. Mm-hmm. And the common ancestor is this flatworm that modern genetics is able to go into fossils and stuff and pick out things that existed back then. And sure enough, some of those molecules were there. And we still have living ancestors of the flatworm, for example, jellyfish. They have those molecules, not everyone, but they have synaptic plasticity molecules. Now, sponges don't have a nervous system, but they have synaptic plasticity molecules. And protozoa, the single-cell organisms from which all animals evolved, also have the molecules. What are they doing with synaptic plasticity molecules, but no nervous system? So that was the wrong question. The question is, how did the molecules that the protozoa have get converted or, what do you call it, borrowed to make synaptic plasticity molecules, because evolution doesn't make things new. It takes stuff you have and kind of modifies it. So, and you could go even further back with those molecules. So, and it turns out that, these protozoa behave. They detect danger and move away from it. And not only that, they undergo Pavlovian conditioning. So, and if you go into bacteria, they also undergo Pavlovian conditioning and have behavior. So the point is that when we talk about these survival behaviors, to call them emotions and attach that emotion word to them does them disservice. They have been there very, very long in the history of life. And we need to pay respect to what they are and not over-attribute things to them. They don't make fear. Fear is the cognitive interpretation of the situation you're in. So back to why I started writing The Four Realms. So I was writing a series of articles for Current Biology. The editor there, Jeff, had he liked the way I wrote one, or I wrote this review for him called The Amygdala, which was one of their best reviewed, most viewed reviews in their history at that point. So he asked me to write some more articles. And these are great because all you have to do is write, like, I don't know, a couple of thousand words. There's no peer review. He's the peer reviewer if it passes his muster. It's kind of like you can say whatever you want. It's called my word. So it's my word. It's not anybody else's word. And it just like allows you to explore some ideas. And one of the ideas I explored in one of the articles was the starting point was, what is consciousness, and why do we have all this extra philosophical stuff associated with it? And maybe we could get more focused. And one of the things that came out of it was to explore the idea of narrations as a way of kind of populating our conscious experiences. And so I started thinking about that. And then I can't remember the exact sequence, but ultimately I started, if I'm saying, okay, I've got all this stuff that's going back in evolution that is kind of layered into the human body and brain, right? The deep history of ourselves, I said, was about the way we were, but the four realms of existence is about the way we are. It's about the same things. That it's kind of like looking back in evolution. So we've got, an evolutionarily programmed body that we've borrowed from our ancestors that only had bodies. So, some animals, only animals that have, let's say, I want to say this. Some organisms only exist biologically, all right? Single cell organisms only exist biologically. Even in the multicellular organisms, plants and fungi only exist biologically. They don't have a nervous system. So only animals have a nervous system. So only animals can exist neurobiologically. And that offers a lot of advantages, right? Because neurobiological existence allows you to control your body in unique ways for, obtaining food, avoiding danger, getting your liquids and so forth. You can do that much more effectively, but it's a much more challenging job, and you need a lot more metabolism than you have as just a pure biological organism. So if we think of like the biological organism unit is a system for metabolism that's keeping you alive, generating metabolism, right? And the first animals were basically an extension of the biological realm because they developed nervous systems that allowed the biological realm to do its metabolic, what do you say? how they could like approach metabolism
Yeah.
more effectively with a nervous system than without. So there's a guy named Alfred Sherwood Romer. He was a very prominent comparative paleontologist.
Mm-hmm.
And I had read when I was first starting neuroscience, I'd read a lot of books that had talked about animative and visceral existence in the body. You got the somatic body and the visceral body. Well, Romer picked up on that in the 1950s and said that we've partitioned the nervous system in the wrong way. It's not about a central and peripheral nervous system, because central and peripheral nervous systems did not exist as the primary condition of the nervous system. What existed was you take the basic biological needs and you divide those into visceral and somatic functions, then the internal and the external. And the central and peripheral components of the nervous system were not there in the first animals, like jellyfish. They had diffuse nervous system, nerve nets. They had no centralization to speak of. But they had visceral and somatic components. So that is the primary condition. So we should think of the body and the nervous system as a continuous connection of visceral and somatic activities at the biological level and the neurobiological level. And the central and peripheral location is just, how you get the nerves to from one kind of nervous system to two kinds. It's just a way of dividing the nerves. But the key thing is the nerves are processing either somatic or visceral functions. So that became very important. And I had this picture of how the amygdala connects to the autonomic nervous system to control, autonomic response like blood pressure and heart rate and release of hormones and all of that stuff. And on the other side of the picture, the amygdala is separated, like the ANS component, and then the component that controls freezing behavior or escape behavior and so forth. So I had written what Romer described in my work. It came out of my work that there was different pathways out of the amygdala to control visceral and somatic nervous system. So his thing was like an eye-opener for me. And that became the foundation for the biological transition to the neurobiological realm. And then the next transition was the transition from the mere neurobiological realm, where you have instincts, like, fixed action patterns, as the ethologists call them, reflexes, and stimulus response habits. None of those involve cognition, right? They're automatic responses. So the next level up is the cognitive level. So there you can have instrumental responses that are goal-directed and involve cognition. And you then can also have internal representations of the world that you hold information in mind and make decisions about and so forth. But again, all unconsciously. And then finally, out of a very sophisticated cognitive realm, you evolve the conscious realm. So that was the whole thing. It's like how one thing led to another. It was really a continuation of deep history, but just putting it into our bodies.
Right. But how do we get at consciousness then? I mean, because as many times people, again, going back to the body dualism thing, people think about consciousness as a sort of, I don't know, magical stuff out there. But I mean, from a neurobiological and then adding the cognitive perspective, how do we go from the cognitive level to the conscious level then?
So one of the things I wrote in the Four Realms book, and I've been writing a Psychology Today blog for a long time, and with this book I've written kind of summaries of each realm. And in the conscious realm, I wrote a paper recently. These are like short, little thought pieces. I wrote one called "Is Consciousness Mysterious?" And so I said, well, it depends on what you mean by mysterious. Do you mean mysterious in the way of a soul that survives death, or in the way that DNA was mysterious before the inheritance was mysterious before DNA was discovered? And I think that's the way I think of consciousness, more like the discovery of DNA than the search for the soul that survives death, So, there, and it's very hard to talk about consciousness because so many people talk about it as if it's one thing. But I have long been following a partition that Endel Tulving proposed long ago between autonoetic consciousness, which is self-awareness, awareness of yourself, noetic consciousness, which is knowledge of facts and concepts, and anoetic consciousness, which is, let's hold that one for a second because it's complicated. So, but if we just take autonoetic and noetic and realize that autonoetic consciousness is based on episodic memory, and noetic consciousness is based on semantic memory. So the fact that episodic and semantic memory are the stepping stones to noetic and autonoetic consciousness means that you have an anchor in the brain that takes you pretty close to the consciousness finishing line, right? It's through episodic memory and through semantic memory that you get there. So those should be the anchor points from which to explore how consciousness can exist in other ways. And whether you want to talk about that in terms of global workspace or in terms of higher order theory, which I prefer, you have an anchor point to build on. So I think it's an underappreciated kind of tool that we have. The third kind of consciousness is a little weirder. So the third kind of consciousness is anoetic. And that is a kind of very strange thing that Tulving didn't explain very well. And I struggled for many years. And, I was Jaak Panksepp and I had very different ideas about emotion, but we both used Tulving's scheme. And the only thing that was different, and Tulving's scheme showed me what was different about what Jaak and I believe. The only thing that was different is whether the amygdala was the source of fear, actual fear, or whether it was a lower order state that had to be re-represented for the fear to be experienced. That was my position, the latter one, and the lower, it's all in the amygdala state was his. I mean, it wasn't just amygdala, periaqueductal array, and so forth. But what many people don't realize that Jaak was not talking about the kind of consciousness we have. He was talking about the kind of consciousness that a rat has called anoetic consciousness, which is, as he called in his book, Affective Neuroscience, he says, it's basically like literally unconscious. It's unconscious consciousness. It's so primitive that you never experience it unless it's so intense that it moves up into noetic consciousnness and into autonoetic consciousness. It's like, okay, you walk into your apartment, you don't have to say, this is my apartment. Everything, everything is yours. You don't have to acknowledge that. But if you walk in and all of a sudden, the table is upturned and books are all over the place, all of a sudden that you've moved from everything is right, anoetic consciousness, to everything is wrong, noetic consciousness has recognized that. And then, oh my God, maybe someone's here, they're going to mug me, into autonoetic. So anoetic is very primitive. And for me, I think the only way to think about it is in order to get it into noetic and autonoetic as Jacques said, it's got to be intense to cross that line. But I think that the feeling of rightness that he talked about is not something that is just down there. I think it's also something that exists at a higher level in the medial prefrontal cortex that all mammals share. I think it's a kind of consciousness all mammals share. It's this sense that, everything is right until it's not right. And once it's not right, we have more complicated things to bump it up to. Animals may have some kind of nonverbal semantic memory that they could bump it up to a little bit. But with verbal knowledge, you get much more, fancy stuff going with it. But anyway, the idea that the anoetic is the fringe of consciousness that William James talked about. It's stuff that hovers on the verge of consciousness, but is never conscious or unconscious. It's right there at that level. And so it's ready to be bumped up or ready just to stay there. And this philosopher, Bruce Mangan, says that this fringe consciousness, its job is to translate the deep unconscious into something that can be made available to consciousness under certain conditions. So this anoetic consciousness is a transition from the deepest, inaccessible unconscious. Only some things can get up there and be pulled up through anoetic and into noetic.
So, by distinguishing between these different kinds of consciousness, what kind of progress can we make in terms of having a better understanding of what consciousness is, or how it arises and stuff like that?
So one way to do it that I propose, and it's in Current Biology in one of these articles, this is purely hypothetical, but let's say that if we were to know more about how these three kinds of consciousness work in the human brain and knew exactly, which circuits are involved. For example, let's say that the autonoetic consciousness, self-consciousness, requires the lateral frontal pole, which exists as a unique structure present only in the human brain. Mm-hmm. And to the extent that many people think that, the philosophers, scientists think that this kind of autonoetic, self-reflective consciousness may be on the human, that might be a good candidate to look for that kind of consciousness in. But we're just talking about speculation now. Let's say that the unique part of the human brain is where we have this unique kind of autonoetic consciousness. Not alone, of course. You need hippocampus for episodic memories and all of that. And you got to get them through many steps to get them to the frontal pole. But we also know that there's some evidence in humans that for kinds of consciousness like semantic consciousness, can you consciously see an apple? Do you need only visual cortex to consciously see the apple? That would be the first order theory, like Ned Block. Or do you need prefrontal cortex in order to turn that into a conscious representation? That would be higher order theory. It would also be the kind of theory that people like Carl Friston talk about, because he says it's all a kind of top-down illusion. That would be kind of working memory illusion about it. Mm-hmm. So, and Global Workspace says you need at least a cognitive representation to rebroadcast it back to the other areas and so forth. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which plays a key role in all that stuff, is only in primates. So that might be a kind of noetic consciousness that we have using dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that includes verbal noetic awareness, verbal semantic awareness, conceptual semantic awareness. But in monkeys who have almost identical dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in terms of structure, that might be nonverbal semantic and conceptual knowledge. But other mammals don't have this dorsolateral granular prefrontal cortex. Also, the frontal pole is granular prefrontal cortex. The rest of animals, including us, have agranular or dysgranular, whatever you're going to call it, prefrontal cortex that all mammals share. So that might be the kind of cortex that allows these anoetic, crude, fringe of consciousness feelings to be shared by all mammals. And that is exactly what Jaak Panksepp said. It's the kind of thing that is shared by all mammals. He wouldn't put it in the medial prefrontal cortex, he'd put it in the subcortex. But that's the only difference between our views. So we got mammalian consciousness shared by all mammals, primate consciousness shared by all primates, and maybe human consciousness perhaps shared by great apes. We don't know what's going on in their brains because it's illegal to study ape brains. So I think it's a good kind of way to kind of retrofit or reverse engineer consciousness in other animals based on what we can expect in our brains. So if we can kind of like test for how far our rats can go beyond this anoetic feeling, then they might get into kind of some semantic, nonverbal semantic rat-like, not primate-like, but rat-like semantic noetic awareness. I don't know. That's just a speculation.
So let me just ask you then one final question, and you've already touched a little bit on this throughout the conversation when you mentioned, for example, that the way we conceptualize things, the way we talk about things, the way we talk about the mind, mental states, mental experiences are sometimes problematic or might become obstacles in the way that we understand these different kinds of realms of existence, their relationship, and so on, and phenomena like consciousness, I guess. In the book, you claim at a certain point that ideas like the self are increasingly barriers to discovery and understanding, and that we've sort of hit an epistemological wall. So
Right.
What do you mean exactly by that? And if we've really hit this epistemological wall, how can we go beyond that obstacle?
Yeah. So, again, this goes back to the issue of what we should take from philosophy and what we shouldn't take it.
Okay.
So just because we got this notion of the self from philosophers doesn't mean that everything a philosopher says about the self is golden and written in stone. So the self is a good starting point, but even scientists have come to think of it in ways that I think are not productive. So there are two ways to think of the self, one productive and the other not productive. The unproductive one, I think, is when we reify it as a kind of thing inside us, something besides who we are, that, myself did it, or that I have this thing in me that does things. But what is the self in there besides you? Why do you need something besides you? Why do you need a self as a separate thing in charge? Because they're related to executive function, but it's just adding a thing we don't need. You have executive function. You don't need a self with you have executive function, not yourself. The self is like a little ghost in there that's giving us a lot of trouble. The one way that the self is, I think, scientifically valid is the narrative self, because we do narrate who we are. And those narrations become part of our understanding. We can narrate, we can re-narrate, we can change our narration. But these narrations become beliefs sometimes. The beliefs become so strong that counter evidence to the contrary is rejected. We see this a lot in politics on both sides these days. A lot of things are so firmly believed that nobody gives on anything. And so those are all narratives cultural narratives. There are all kinds of narratives, family narratives, personal narratives, cultural narratives, and it's amazing we get along at all because we have so many ideas about who we are and who we're not. I'm trying to write a book now on how, it's kind of a memoir about how I've narrated my life over the course of it, and what I think of my narration now that I was narrating back then.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to it. And the book is, again, The Four Realms of Existence, a new theory of being human. I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. So, Dr.
I prefer a new framework for being human. The publisher insisted I say new theory.
Oh, okay.
Just
okay.
in case people think that's too pretentious. Framework you get by.
Yeah, great. So, Dr. LeDoux, thank you so much for coming
Always
on
great
the
talking
show.
to you, Ricardo.
Yeah.
Really fun. Always try. Anytime. I'm always happy.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingboard, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.